Welcome, everyone, to the Returners Hideout Final Fantasy podcast. I'm your host, Lenard Phillips, and last week we sort of hit the 35th anniversary of the Final Fantasy series as a whole. We looked at the release of the first game. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and today we're going to talk about the sort of unfair treatment that Final Fantasy III got here in the States. And before I say anything else, if you look at reviews of Final Fantasy III, the DS version and the Steam version, it got pretty high marks. And so, I don't know, maybe I'm a little out of line for saying some of these things. But anyway, so we're going to get into the release of the Japanese version for NES, or their version of the NES, which is called the Famicom. And then we're going to look at, just like we did last week, sort of where it's at now. And then why I actually don't like the DS release, but how I'm still glad it's there regardless. So if you're just listening through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you find your podcast at, this is actually a sister podcast to my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/The Returners Hideout, where we do, I don't know, just deep dives and conspiracy theories. I've got some how-tos coming up, and I post clips of this podcast there. Videos are going to start coming out daily over there. I don't want to make any sort of crazy announcement, but I'm working on getting daily content over there. But that's neither here nor there. Today is Final Fantasy III Day. Before we begin, I would like to take just a second and thank Buzzsprout for hosting this podcast and getting it basically syndicated to all sorts of places. Like I said earlier, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Audible, I think, is another one, which is super cool. So thank you to Buzzsprout for offering that whole... Like I said, I'm not sponsored by Buzzsprout or anyone for that matter. I'm amazed at how much it can do. So anyway, jumping right in, the original Famicom release of Final Fantasy III in Japan was on April 27th, 1990. And if you missed last week's podcast, I kind of talked about how the magazine known as Famitsu was the only magazine that gave Final Fantasy a shot in the very beginning. And fast forwarding a couple of years, Famitsu gave it a 36 out of 40 rating, which, if you know anything about Famitsu, its rating system is always crazy strict. They're super hardcore about the games that they review and how they give scores out. And so for this game to get a 36 out of 40 at the time was a pretty big deal. And actually it ranked just behind Dragon Quest IV for the year of 1990. So initially it did really well in Japan. It was sort of... I would consider this to be, at that moment, the best one that had come out so far. And if you played the very first Final Fantasy, if you notice in the opening cutscene, whenever you cross the bridge, there's a little segment that comes up that sort of tells the story and sets the scene as to, you know, what will happen and what has happened so far. If you notice towards the end of that little cutscene, there is a segment that says programmed by Nasser. And that is referring to Nasser Gabelli, who programmed all of Final Fantasy I single-handedly. And he also programmed Final Fantasy II and now Final Fantasy III in this one. And basically, in short, I'll touch on this another day, but basically, in short, he was a very sought-after programmer at the time. Super talented programmer, could do anything. Basically like Satoru Iwata. Later on, who did, Earthbound, I believe. He completely redid the scripting for... There's a lot of stuff that Iwata did. And Nasser Gabelli was pretty much the same thing. Just a highly sought after. He's an Iranian programmer. And actually went on to hang out with like John Romero, who made Doom and was part of id Software. So they sort of hung out for a while. And also, funnily enough, one more little tidbit about Nasser Gabelli. He actually programmed... or helped program Secret of Mana for Square a few years after Final Fantasy III. And when I found that out, I was like, oh my gosh, like, there it is. If you watch the opening credits, it's there. You can see it. And I wanted to bring up just a really quick, interesting tidbit about Final Fantasy II and III potentially being programmed together at the same time. Because in both wiki articles for Final Fantasy II and III, it says midway through production, Nasser Gabelli had to go back to Sacramento, California, where he lives currently, and the entirety of Square at the time, or maybe just the Final Fantasy team, moved with him, all the way back to Sacramento, California, where they finished out development. And it says this on both articles. So I don't know if it's more specifically in Final Fantasy 3 or 2, or they were made at the same time. I don't know specifically. And so me, in 2006, whenever Final Fantasy 3 released for the Nintendo DS, I was fairly new, and I think a lot of us were still fairly new to the idea that how we got Final Fantasy in the States was wrong. As we know, Final Fantasy 2 is 4 and 3 is 6. There's a whole mess about that. And so it was around this time that YouTube started becoming pretty prevalent. The internet as a whole was much more accessible. I mean, pretty much everybody in 06 had something. And I was able to find little screenshots of the original Final Fantasy 3. And then, because I was subscribed to this particular magazine, there was an article that ran about Final Fantasy 3 being ported to Nintendo DS, and I was all over it. In fact, I was so all over it, in my old yearbook, I actually have the original clipping that came out in 2006, along with a couple other clippings that I have of, like, the original advertisement for Final Fantasy VI Advance. That's super neat. But I was reading through this, and I came across something very interesting. So, Final Fantasy 3 came out, as I said earlier, in 1990. And there was a game for the NES called Gradius, and that game was a 2D space shooter, and it was huge. And I was reading this here excerpt from an interview, and the interview was with Hiromichi Tanaka, who was the director of not only the remake, but also the original game. And the interview goes on, and he basically talks about how Gradius and another game called Zanuck was a big inspiration for Final Fantasy III as far as power-ups. Basically, he looked at power-ups in Gradius as the job system, which is supremely interesting to me, and I never would have ever thought to put the two games together. But, I mean, it's right here in this article, which is in EGM, if you need to go back and look for any reason. I don't know why you would. But I read this article recently, gearing up for this podcast, and I found that incredibly fascinating. However, I don't like how EGM handles the release of Final Fantasy III. The very first line says, "Final Fantasy fanboys can now shut up." So that's whatever it is. But anyway, I had to bring this out and look at it. I knew I had it tucked away somewhere, so I went out and found it. And there's a crossword back here, so that's neat. So now we're going to sort of pivot, and we're going to look at where Final Fantasy III is at now compared to 1990. And basically, the game now is doing very well. In last week's podcast, I noted that Final Fantasy I had sort of not necessarily a difficult time getting off the ground. Square only wanted to put out 200,000 copies of the game, and Hironobu Sakaguchi wanted double that, and he wanted 400,000. They ended up selling about 500,000 copies altogether. Final Fantasy III, whenever it released, sold 500,000 copies in its first week. And at this point, it's sold 1.93 million units worldwide. The game did well, and it continues to do well, especially now with the pixel remasters being released. And the DS version gets an average, if you look at all the reviews of the DS version, which is consequently the Steam version also, if you look at all the reviews combined, it gets an average of about a 4 out of 5 stars. And so, why do I say it gets an unfair treatment when I'm talking about the game as a whole, whenever it was ported over to DS here in the States? Back in 2006. And so this is I don't know, this is sort of weird, and it's sort of why I don't personally like the DS version myself, and I'm just going to put it out there, and I know it kind of goes against everything, but here we go. Through what limited knowledge I did have of how Final Fantasy III started off on the Famicom version in Japan, I knew that you ultimately started off with all 4 characters in your party as you go through the cave in the very beginning, and the DS version eliminated that. And all 4 characters they didn't really have personalities too much, they just sort of served as a blank slate. And then in the DS version, they had very, very sort of strict personalities. This is how they are, this is how Lunith is, this is how Refia is. But I don't think that works well when you're dealing with something that introduced a job system as in-depth as it was. I don't think that's the way to do it. I think the blank slate way of introducing characters is probably the best way in that specific context due to the job system and how customizable everything was. And I don't think you found your 4th character into maybe 10-15 minutes into the game. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seemed to me about maybe 20 minutes into the game is when you finally found your 4th character and felt like it was a complete unit and you could continue on. And I just wasn't a fan of that. I like the idea of all 4 people being in the party at the same time in the very beginning, and that's where the adventure starts, and that's how it ends also. And I really felt like it was, I don't know, going back and playing it recently, it feels a little clunky, it feels a little slow, and I really feel like a handheld release of something, because a lot of us wanted that game to be released in any official way, and we got the DS version I just don't feel like it should have been on a handheld console of any kind. I'll learn how to talk here in a second. I don't feel like it should have been on a handheld console. I really feel like it should have been on... I mean, in 06 we had... I'm pretty sure at that point we had the PlayStation 3. Yeah, in November of 2006 is when we had the PS3. So the PS2 was very prominent at the time. I'm really racking my own brain here behind the scenes, because I'm looking at 2006 as a release date, and I'm thinking, well, the PS3 was out at that point, but it was only out on Nintendo consoles as far as I knew, and then I remembered the PSP port, which was a Japanese-only copy of it that you could get here in the States, but it was never announced. All you had to do was buy the Japanese copy and switch the language over to English, and boom, you've got a PSP copy of the game, which is a Sony console. Why we didn't get... I don't know. They could have released it for Wii or something. I just don't feel like the handheld strategy was the way to go with this particular release. And as I said, it's sort of slow and clunky, and every time that you choose commands in battle, the camera does the same rotation. When an enemy does anything, it's the same movement. Everything feels very repetitive. And, I mean, any Final Fantasy sort of feels repetitive. But when the camera movements are doing the same movements, not just in general, but also the same coordinates on screen, it just seems like, I don't know, for me, I ended up beating it on the Nintendo DS not long after it came out. But to see videos of the original where battles were taking you 2 and 3 seconds to get through, and then on the DS, it was like a minute and a half endeavor where you had to watch camera movements and all sorts of stuff in order to just attack. I don't know. It seemed a little slow-paced for me. I really wanted there to be the option of having the 2D version along with it. And there was a failed WonderSwan port of it that nobody ever got, actually. But looking at screenshots of it, I would have loved it. Even though I didn't have a WonderSwan, but that's besides the point. But in the end, we did get the Nintendo DS port, and for what it was our introduction to the game. It was solid. It was all right. I complain about it a little bit, but at the end of the day, I'm still really glad it's there. Camera movements and animations that take a little long, it still doesn't interrupt what's a really good story. It still doesn't take away from the story. It still doesn't take away from the music. In fact, the music sounds great. As great as a Nintendo DS sound chip can produce anyway. It sounds amazing to me. That's where I first fell in love with one of the songs on there, and I forget what it's called right now. The Boundless Ocean is what it's called. That's where I first heard that, and I fell in love with that song. Going through and meeting these characters in the game and experiencing the story that we never got, that was 16 years old in Japan, that we were finally getting. It was neat, and it was super cool, and I'm really glad that we got a release of it at all. And actually, with the Steam version, if you hook it up to a nice big TV and you got like a stereo system, like in my living room currently, the TV and every console in there hooked up to a stereo unit. And so, everything's sort of a theater. Everyone was just watching YouTube videos. It's a big theater event. And if you, plug up your computer to a nice big TV and hook everything up to a stereo unit, dude, it's amazing. It's super fun. Again, I'm very happy it's there. And now with the release of the Pixel Remaster, I do get to experience the 2D version of it. And I would like to do, eventually on the YouTube channel, I would like to do a comparison of both and see which one you can get through faster. Because I know that there are differences other than the speed of battle and all that sort of stuff. The Onion Knight is different in both of them. That's a story for another day, though. In the end, did Final Fantasy III get an unfair treatment here in the States? Not really, but I have a few little gripes in, I don't know, some of it still kind of makes me upset. Like, it's difficult even for me now to go back and play the Steam port or the DS port of it, because now I have the 2D version, and that's the version I wanted for well over a decade. But anyway, Final Fantasy III is a fantastic game. I've actually got a video coming up in a few weeks about how much I fell in love with that game. Until then, thank you for listening. And one more time, head over to youtube.com/Returner's Hideout to see way more content about the deep dives and stuff in the Final Fantasy series. I want to thank Buzzsprout one more time for hosting this podcast. I think it's incredible of what they're doing. Oh, and one more thing before you go. I want everyone to remember that it's always 6:10:50 somewhere.